Character came from the University of Chicago, where I went, little Western Civ. My favorite saying about Chicago is it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students. Thomas Aquinas, I left off the end. And I had Western Civ, which introduced me to the idea of some of these issues. But I do think you have to veer toward religion to get to the end of them. And so I'm going to start, and it's been interesting over the last hour, those of us who were in the room for that. One thing for sure is we're seeing the same world. We're seeing the world of inflated selves. We're seeing in the world of moral inarticulacy. And so one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is the belief that I have that to introduce character, it's important to introduce exemplars, and I'm going to throw in a few in the next few minutes, but it's really important to give people an architecture of their soul, at least some scheme so they can begin to understand themselves and how things are fitting together and not fitting together. And so I'm going to start with an architecture of the soul, not mine, but it's borrowed from a rabbi. And this architecture begins with the two accounts of creation in the book of Genesis. The first one, which says that man was created in God's image, and he should be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over it. The second one, a few paragraphs later, has a humbler view of man, that man is formed out of the dust of the ground. His job is to stay home and tend to the Garden of Eden and to serve it, a much more humbler view. A rabbi named Joseph Soloveitchik in 1965 published a book called The Lonely Man of Faith, where he said that these two accounts in Genesis account for the two sides of human nature, which he called Adam 1 and Adam 2. And this understanding of Adam 1 and Adam 2 is different than some Christian understandings. These are two equal sides of our nature. Adam 1 is majestic Adam, the first account of Genesis. Adam 1 is the worldly Adam, who wants to create, produce, discover things, wants to have a great career, earn victories. Successful. Adam 2 is humble Adam. Humble Adam is connected to a transcendental moral order outside of himself. Adam 2 can be stern because he rigorously serves the truth, but he's tender because he seeks humility, sacrifice, and redemption. Adam 2 wants to not only do good, but to be good. And Adam 2 is concerned with inner goodness. So while Adam 1 wants to conquer the world, Adam 2 wants to hear and obey and God's call. While Adam 1 is savoring accomplishments, Adam 2 seeks to return home and have redemption. While Adam 1 wants to ask how things work, Adam 2 wants to ask why things exist. And so Adam 1's motto is success, Adam 2's motto is love, redemption, and return. And Soloveitchik argues that we are great because we live in the contradiction between these two Adams. The outer majestic Adam and the inner humble Adam are not reconcilable. We're perpetually confronting ourselves between these two sides of our nature. And the confrontation between these two sides of our nature is difficult because they operate by different logics. The first Adam has a pretty straightforward logic, the logic of the world, the logic of economics. Input leads to output, effort leads to reward, practice makes perfect. Adam 2 lives by an inverse logic, which is a moral logic, which is filled with ironies. You have to surrender to something outside yourself to gain strength within yourself. You have to conquer your desire to get what you want. Failure leads to success because it leads to learning. Learning sometimes leads to failure. And so his argument, we have these two sides, and with two different logics. We happen to live in a society with an imbalance. We live in a meritocratic culture where Adam 1 is praised and rewarded and paid attention to, and Adam 2 is not rewarded and sometimes neglected. And I would say most of us, and certainly me through most of my life, have been primarily Adam 1 oriented, career and worldly oriented. And what of Adam's ones? But if you are only that, and I would say my students are frequently only that, you turn into sort of a shrewd animal, crafty, playing life as a game and turning everything into a game. One of Adam 1's sins is that he makes himself the center of the world. He identifies himself as the whole personality and doesn't acknowledge that Adam 2 exists. He has his own instrumental way of thinking and doesn't recognize there are other ways of thinking. And even when he deals with religion, he tries to turn religion into a business deal. I give you a little prayer, you give me a little joy and salvation. And so that is the sin of Adam 1. Adam 2 has its own sins, though. It's more spiritual and more humble, but it has its own sins. One of them is to withdraw from the world, to want to return to an island of monastic purity. One of them is to not take Reinhold Niebuhr seriously and understand that you have to take morally hazardous action to do anything in the world. And there's sort of a left-wing version of this sin, which are things like pacifism, to think we can all be brought together through love. There's sort of a right-wing version, which is the self-righteousness of the culture warrior. And so the job in life is to find a balance between these two atoms. And Soloveitchik would say there's no resting point, because as the world changes, as life changes, you're always trying to be both things, innerly good, outwardly successful. But this struggle is the central drama of life, not only finding the balance, but struggling against the sins within each sides of our nature. And life is properly organized around two sets of these struggles, against the balance and against sin. And people should regard the struggle against sin and weakness as the central drama of life, more important than outward achievement. It's a campaign that gives excitement to life. The campaign against your own internal weakness gives drama to the day. It gives consequence to the struggle over your inner nature. And that character is nothing more or less than your way of waging this campaign. That if you don't have the concept of inner struggle and inner flaw, you do not have the concept of character. Character only applies to the struggle against your own sinfulness. And if you take that concept of the struggle away, then you've drained character of all meaning. It just becomes a good word that you hope to have. And so that concept of sin is elemental to the concept of character. And if you don't know what sin is, and if you don't accept that you're sinful, then you really are not fighting against anything. You're just special. Now, this is sort of a broad theoretical overview, and I'm going to now switch and try to give you some lived examples of people who have had different versions of a balance between Adam 1 and Adam 2. And this is where I get to a lot of things we were talking about earlier, exemplars. My first exemplar is a woman named Frances Perkins, who was born in 1880 on April 10th in New England in Maine, traditional Yankee upbringing. Her parents had a code of reticence and self-control. Her mother pulled her aside when she was a young girl, and this is sort of the New England upbringing many of us might be familiar with, and gave her some honest advice on how to buy a hat. Mother takes her in a store, puts a hat on her head, and said, "This, my dear, is your hat. You should always wear a hat like this. You have a very broad face. It's broader between the cheekbones than it is up at the top. Your head is narrower above the temples than above the cheekbones, and it lops off very suddenly into your chin. The result is you always need to have as much width in your hat as you have width in your cheekbones. Never let yourself wear a narrow hat because it makes you look ridiculous." And that's sort of a stern, straightforward, honest talking to. But I do think that captures a bit of an ethos. And so she went off to Mount Holyoke College, class of 1902. Mount Holyoke had a lot of the rules of a lot of schools that you are familiar with. Here's some of the rules for Mount Holyoke in 1902. Freshmen should keep a respectful silence in the presence of sophomores. Freshmen meeting a sophomore on campus should bow respectfully. No freshman shall wear high hair or long skirt before mid-year examinations. So this was a school that was very confident about telling students about how to behave. It was, nonetheless, a completely remarkable university for its time. In the first place, because it was totally focused on character first. Among the concrete manifestations of that was that it picked out not what students are strong at, but what they were weak at. So what Frances Perkins was strong at was verbal dexterity, so they made her take a year of Latin so she would learn rote memorization. Her weakest subject was science. They made her major in science so she could get some discipline of mind. The other thing they did at Mount Holyoke was they were caught up in the social gospel movement, and they sent their women, it was all women, obviously, out to do missionary work in Pakistan, Nepal, Tibet, Africa. This is 1902. They sent them off alone. I came across a record of the missionaries who were, all the American missionaries abroad in the world at that time, 20% of them were Mount Holyoke grads. They all went out. Perkins actually didn't go abroad. She went to Chicago and served at Hull House, Jane Addams' Hull House. And it was a life of service. She then is in New York in 1911. She's having tea on the north side of Washington Square Park, and she hears a commotion. The ladies rush out onto the square, turn left, and they see a fire. She's stumbled across the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. She runs over there and sees what she thinks are people throwing bundles of clothing off the 9th and 10th floor of the building, but they're not bundles of clothing, they're human beings jumping to their death to avoid being burned to death. She watches 57 people do this. One guy picks up a woman, pulls her over the void, drops her, picks up another, picks up another, picks up the fourth. They have a long kiss and embrace, then he drops her, and then he himself goes over the edge. People trying to avoid being burned to death. This event has a mobilizing effect on her life. She is no longer just what she had been before, which is sort of a naive do-gooder. She becomes a much more hard-headed figure, and she's in her 30s now. She takes a job and goes up and lobbies for worker safety in Albany. And the other progressives do not like dealing with Tammany Hall, but she has become a much more hardened figure. And she will deal with Tammany Hall. But she still has trouble getting taken seriously by them. She keeps a folder while as a lobbyist up in Albany called Notes on the Male Mind. And one of the things she discovers about the men is that they'll take her seriously if she reminds them of her mother, of their mothers. And so she dresses as a 7-year-old woman. She wears pearls, a tri-corner hat, an old-fashioned hairstyle. She gets the nickname Mother Perkins. And this is her way of surrendering her own attractiveness, her own sensuality to serve the cause. And she becomes very close to all the Tammany Hall politicians. Then she runs into Al Smith, who is her hero, and then Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt appoints her as the first woman to be in the cabinet in the United States, Secretary of Labor. She is the first woman in the cabinet, so of course news stories want to do a lot of, the news organizations want to do a lot of stories about her. She refuses. She says, "We New Englanders like to keep ourselves to ourselves." Frankly, she said, "I don't care who writes it, I'm embarrassed by revelation. I'm embarrassed by Andre Gide's candid revelations, not because they are revelations of a particular sexual nature, but because they tell all, which seems to me is not necessary. It embarrasses me to think that a human being who has the rights of liberty, the basis of which is privacy, will so degrade himself as to expose his whole life and thinking, to throw away the privacy which he's entitled to and which God gave him." She is a true New Englander, and she is keeping quiet all the privacy in order to serve this cause. She then goes on and serves Roosevelt for his entire term of office. She she's instrumental in many New Deal things. In 1939, she's somewhat left-wing. She becomes the target of impeachment hearings from the early Red Scare, early McCarthyites. They accuse her of being a communist. Roosevelt decides it's too politically risky to defend her, so he does not defend her. The women's organizations decide it's too risky to not defend her. They don't defend her. But her reticence and her tough-mindedness and the New England self-control save her. She writes later, "Of course, if I had wept at all, or if I'd let myself down at all, I would have disintegrated. That's the kind of person which we New Englanders are. We disintegrate if we do these things. All the qualities of us in integrity and the ability to keep our heads clear and make decisions and take actions that are influenced by our personal suffering or personal effect on ourselves, that integrity would have been scattered. I would have not had the inner core within myself which makes it possible for me to rely on myself under the guidance of God to do the right thing. And so this is a woman who has grown up with a certain moral atmosphere, a certain moral ecology, which is the New England self-control and reticence, what you might call more on the Adam 1 side, and has created a code by which to live. And the final coda to Frances Perkins' life, she, at the end of her career, she's living in New York, she gets invited to teach at Cornell, and she's teaching at Cornell, but she's living alone. Her husband, who spent most of his life in an insane asylum, had passed away. And some boys invite her to live in their scholarly house, a house called Telluride House. And she becomes the next-door roommate of Alan Bloom, who writes The Closing of the American Mind, and one of her pallbearers is a guy named Paul Wolfowitz, who helped run the Iraq War. I just find that historical accident interesting. But she's an example of a balance, a spiritual person, but who imposed what you might call a victory-oriented rigor onto that. The parallel person, the career I'm going to describe, is more on the Adam 2 side. And this is Dorothy Day. Dorothy Day began her life as a young radical in Greenwich Village. She covered labor unrest. She interviewed Trotsky. She was a radical bohemian in 19-teens and 1920s. And she loved Dostoevsky and read Dostoevsky and really modeled herself a bit on Dostoevsky. But it was a radically disoriented life. She slept around a lot. She drank a lot. She attempted suicide. She had an abortion. And she marched a lot. But the effect of her marching was different than it was on most of her colleagues, because she was a remarkably self-reflective and astoundingly self-critical human being. And so when she's arrested, she goes to jail, and after her first arrest, which was a suffragette march, she wrote, "I had the ugly sense of futility of human effort, man's helpless misery, the triumph of might. Evil triumphed, I was a petty creature, filled with self-deception, self-importance, unreal, false, rightly scorned and punished." So we're talking about the kids today who think they're demigods. She's the exact opposite. She has an intense sense of her own weaknesses. And living this disorganized life in Greenwich Village, these are compounded her awareness. She gets arrested the second time, falsely arrested. She's confused for a prostitute. Nonetheless, she sees as a sign, an indictment of her life. She writes, "I do not think that ever again, no matter of what I'm accused, can I suffer more than I did then of shame and regret and self-contempt, not only because I had been caught, found out, branded, publicly humiliated, because of my own consciousness that I deserved it." And so this is a fierce capacity for humility and self-laceration. A few years later, she gets pregnant, she has a child, and this has a positive transformational effect on her life. After the birth of her child, she writes, "If I had written the greatest book, composed the greatest symphony, painted the most beautiful painting, or created the most exquisite figure, I could not have felt more exalted a creator than I did when they placed the child in my arms." That child created in her a profound sense of gratitude. No human creature could conceive or contain so vast a flood of love and joy as I often felt after the birth of my child. With this came the need to worship, to adore, something she needed to express her gratitude for, and she became a Catholic. And so here is someone a little different than Frances Perkins. Frances Perkins is not that self-reflective, but exercises an iron self-control while being aware of the faithful side of her nature. Dorothy Day is astonishingly self-reflective and astonishingly vulnerable to the world. Or an Adam 2 side, you would say. She goes on to create The Catholic Worker, a radical newspaper. She goes on to create soup kitchens, a series of communes, and a series of homeless shelters. She's sort of a naturally standoffish person, but she forces herself to live in the shelters themselves, with the homeless men mostly, and to spend hours and hours and hours with them. They have a different sense of morality. Frances Perkins was always willing to compromise in order to get something done, to really deal with scandal, deal with sleazebags to get something done. For Day, it was not only important to do good, it was important to be good. She had a more sensitive antennae about her own internal nature. Nonetheless, I think both of these, one more worldly, one more religious and more humble, both of these seem to me admirable, amazingly admirable balances between the two sides of our nature. What's happened over the last 50 years is we've lost the ability to balance these two sides of our nature because we've lost the ability to understand the architecture of ourselves and the sinfulness of ourselves. This happened earlier than I thought. The normal story is the culture war changed in the 1960s. We became good to ourselves. I think it changed much earlier. If you look at the bestseller list right after World War II, there was a book in 1946 by Rabbi Joshua Liebman called Peace of Mind, which urged people to engrave a new morality on their hearts. This is right after World War II, right after the Holocaust, right after the bloodbath of World War II. And he said, let's get rid of sin and temptation. He's going to have a new 10 commandments. Thou shalt not be afraid of thy hidden impulses. Thou shalt transcend inner anxiety. Thou shalt recognize thy true competence and courage. It's a pretty encouraging set of 10 commandments. This book sat number one on the New York Times bestseller list for 58 consecutive weeks. Another book came along in 1949 called The Mature Mind by Harry Overstreet, a professor at CCNY. He was an attack on St. Augustine. This guy had denied to our species, according to Overstreet, our healthy blessings of self-respect. So let's put aside all that sin. Let's leave all that in the past. Let's think well of ourselves. That book sat atop the New York Times bestseller list for 16 straight weeks. Along come Benjamin Spock. He wrote his famous handbook, and one of the things on that handbook says, if your child steals something, don't punish him, just give him an object like the one he stole, and tell him it's fine, just ask for it next time, which I would say is a reasonably optimistic view of human nature. And then along, finally and climactically, comes Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking, which is about how wonderful you are. And that sits atop the New York Times bestseller list for an astonishing 98 weeks, which is still the record. And then along comes Humanistic Psychology, Carl Rogers, who says, we are, in the inner sense, we are astonishingly good. There's no sin there, there's no division there. Rogers writes, man's behavior is exquisitely rational, moving with subtle and ordered complexity toward the goal his organism is endeavoring to achieve. And so this is a sharp break from the world of division and the awareness of sin that Francis Perkins is inhabiting. And so that sort of brings us up more or less to our own day. You go to the commencement speeches, and I'm sure many of you have sat through many of them, which is all about following your passion and how great you are. Celebrity chef Maria Batali told an audience, follow your own truth, expressed consistently by you. Ellen DeGeneres had one, my advice is be true to yourself and everything will be fine. Anna Quinlan said, have the courage to honor your own character, your own intellect, your own inclinations, and yes, your own soul by listening to its clear, clean voice. Moral philosophy coheres to this. The great moral philosopher Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote a book called Eat, Pray, Love. I'm the only man to actually have finished this book. Said you have every right to cherry pick when it comes to moving your spirit and finding peace in God. You take whatever works for you and you find it wherever you can. Gilbert then goes on to define God. God is your own voice from within your own self. God dwells within you as you yourself, exactly the way you are. So that's a reasonably upbeat vision of human nature. This affects the students that we're all living with. In 1950, the Gallup organization, I hope I didn't get this statistic from Jim, the Gallup organization asked high school seniors, are you a very important person? In 1950, 12% say yes. They asked the same question in 2005, and 80% say yes, I'm a very extraordinary person. Psychologists have this thing called the Narcissism Test. They read them a bunch of statements, and they say, does this apply to you? And the statements are things like, I like to be the center of attention, I show off if I get the chance because I'm extraordinary, somebody should write a biography of me. The median narcissism score has gone up 30% in the last 2 decades, as people become reasonably convinced they're incredibly impressive. If you look at American math scores, as you probably know, we're 25th in the world in math. If you ask Americans, are you good in math? We're number 1 in the world in thinking we're really good at math. The country that's actually bottom of thinking they're good in math is South Korea, who are in fact the best at math. Along with this increase in self-esteem has gone an increased desire for fame. Fame used to rank at the very bottom or near the bottom of desired achievements in life. Now it's usually number 2 or 3. And so middle school girls were asked, would you rather be a celebrity's personal assistant or president of Harvard? And of course, 3 times as many would rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant than president of Harvard. Though to be fair, I asked the president of Harvard, and she would rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant. And along with this, I think, has gone this inflation of self, this depressed awareness of the concept of sin, depressed awareness of the concept of internal division, has gone concrete changes in our culture. The first, different attitudes about spending and consumption. If you think you're more or less a humble and flawed being, you're not going to want to spend on yourself in a way that shows off. But if you think you're basically God's gift to humanity, then you're going to want to spend on yourself as befits your nature. And so consumption patterns are very stable across the 20th century until 1970, when they shoot up from personal debt is 43% of GDP, decade after decade. Starting in 1970, it shoots up to 133% of GDP. Vastly different attitudes toward consumption. Second, a decline in seemliness. When we in the newspaper business started publishing CEO salaries, we thought, oh, they'll be embarrassed, and they won't ask for big salaries because they'll be public. That obviously didn't work out. Third, risk. If you think you know very little about the world, then you're going to be reasonably risk averse. We just had a financial crisis caused by people who were incredibly confident they had mastered risk assessments. Fourth, polarization. If you think you have a flawed grasp on reality and that politics is a competition between partial truths, then you're going to realize you need the people on the other side who disagree with you to balance off your own errors. If you think you have truth by the short hairs, the people who disagree with you are just in the way. There's been a decline in intimacy as people have become much more impressed by themselves. In 1985, the average American reported 3 friends with which they could discuss intimate matters. By 2004, it had gone down to under 2, and now it's down even further. Many more people living alone. There are now more households with dogs than with children in America as people live alone. Then I mentioned earlier Christian Smith, moral inarticulateness. If you tell students, you should come up with your own morality, your own system that's right for you. Well, if your name is Nietzsche or Aristotle, you can probably do that. But if it's not, you're going to struggle. And so you get people without any moral views at all, except for what Alistair McIntyre called emotivism. If it feels right for you, that's okay. If it feels right for somebody else, that's okay. And so we've sort of walked away, and I should emphasize, I'm sort of nostalgic for the moral code that existed when Francis Perkins and Dorothy Day were around. I'm not nostalgic for much else about that period. It should be emphasized, none of us should ever want to go back there. It was a more racist culture, a more sexist culture, a poorer culture, and it was a more emotionally starved culture. I've been reading a lot of biographies from that period, and it's worth emphasizing how many people grew up with emotionally starved fathers. And we would never want to go back to that. It's also worth pointing out, as a side note, how many moral views were formed by the death of children. How the death of children had a profound effect on masses of people in a way that's simply not true anymore. And so we've walked, but along with the progress, there's been some collateral damage, and I think that the collateral damage is an awareness of the moral architecture of inside. And it seems to me that's what needs to be rediscovered, both in the schools, in the churches, and the synagogues, and really a vocabulary needs to be rebuilt so people can understand their own divisions, and especially their own weaknesses. And it seems to me there are just a few final rules I'll close with, that if the struggle against your own weakness is the central drama of your life, struggle against my weakness is the central drama of my wife. Okay, we're going back to Freud. That was so if the struggle against weakness is the central drama of your life, then pride is the central vice. Pride is what blinds you to the reality of your divided nature. Pride blinds you to your own weakness. Pride misleads you into thinking you're better than you are. And pride, which is now a positive virtue, has to be regarded as the worst of all sins. Humility, on the other hand, is the central virtue. Humility is not thinking lowly of yourself. Humility is having an accurate assessment of your own nature. Humility is knowing that you're an underdog in the struggle against your own weakness. Humility is knowing that you're not equipped to perform the tasks that history or God has asked you to perform. The third thing to know is that nobody can wage the campaign against your own weakness on your own. Individual will, individual reason, individual compassion are not strong enough to defeat selfishness, sin, pride, and self-deception. You have to rely on something from outside: God, family, friends, rules, ancestors, traditions. And one of the big pivots here, by the way, is a move from a society in which you distrust the self and trust things outside the self to our contemporary society where people trust the self and distrust things outside the self. Rule 4 is defeating weakness often means quieting the self. Only by quieting the self can you tap into external strengths you need. Only by quieting the self can you see the world clearly. Ninth, that the campaign against weakness, or fifth, I throw out random numbers. The campaign against weakness is an ironical campaign. It's filled with paradoxes. Necessary to embrace weakness to build strength. The things you most fervently want success in are often the areas you have to renounce and withdraw from. Your greatest pain leads to your greatest glory. As Soloveitchik himself put it, holiness is not a paradise, but a paradox. Finally, the best social arrangements are those that take full account of the crooked timber of humanity. The highest public virtue is moderation, the ability to seek balance between competing truths. It's always a mistake that you can earn an ultimate victory. It's always a mistake to think you can understand the world because it's too complex for you. And so this is sort of what I'm trying to do in my work, which is rediscover first an architecture of inside and then the laws that apply to it. And I do think there are only two ways to teach morality, basically. One is through habit, through imposing a certain set of very rigorous little disciplines, which will then give you strength to lead a disciplined life overall. And the second is exemplars. And for a writer or a speaker, really the only opportunity is exemplars. And so I do think putting Dorothy Day in front of students, Paul Revere in front of students, Francis Perkins in front of students, at least gives them something to mimic. There's a guy named Alan Melthoff who did an experiment on a baby who was 43 minutes old. He leaned over the baby and he wagged his tongue at her. And she's 43 minutes old. She doesn't know what a face is. She doesn't know what a tongue is. She doesn't know what a self is or what a person is. But she wags her tongue back. Babies are trained to mimic. And this is basically how we learn. And so I do think it's through that exemplar model, if you're not a basketball coach, that's what you have available to you. But it's really, I think the first task is just to revive a moral vocabulary. Revive a word like sin, division, and then everything else will follow. So thank you very much.